In today's video, I want to talk about a slogan that the IIA has had for a long time, and that is progress through sharing. Progress through sharing. And so this slogan has been around, since the IIA started back in the 40s. And the reason I want to talk about it today is actually yesterday I was talking to my friend Doug Jones, who is a chief audit executive. And we were talking about a few things, and this topic came up, and it made me think again about how often this saying is misinterpreted. And we were kind of joking around as we were talking, and credit goes to Doug, and I had to write this down. And he said, "Yeah, it's more like progress through plagiarism," which is why I titled this video the way I did. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is, again, a lot of members of the IIA, a lot of people in internal audit are familiar with this concept, and a lot of them kind of rely on it. But there can be some dangers because a lot of people misunderstand and then kind of misapply what this actually means. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So, how does this show up? Because I think again, as I'm talking, a lot of you that are listening may not even have any understanding of what you may be doing. And why this is important is because the energy that we put out in the world is the energy that we receive back. It's the whole idea of karma, if you've heard about that. And I've talked about karma before, but this is true in this particular instance as well. And so, how does this show up? How do some people misinterpret this? Well, as an example, right, a lot of people say progress through sharing. And what they think that means is everyone in internal audit should share, which again is not wrong, but they think they should share for free. That is wrong. Okay. And let me explain why. So, over the course of the years, and you can see again how local chapters, even the IAA themselves, believe that progress through sharing means free. So if you look at, the different conferences that IAA puts on, for the most part, the speakers who go to chapter meetings or go to international conferences or other conferences held by the IAA, those speakers are not paid. I don't know if you realize that or not, but most of the speakers are asked to do it for free. And so as a result, those of us who do this for a living, I pretty much don't speak at IIA events anymore. The reason is I have bills to pay, right? This is what I do for a living. And so I can't constantly be doing things for free, even though lots of people expect me to do things for free. And don't get me wrong, I do some things for free. I mean, this live video, if you're watching it live, if you sign up the first week, it's an audit discussion, you're probably watching it for free. And that's okay because that's what I am putting out there as free content, right? If you're listening to it later, then maybe you had to pay me a little bit to be able to listen to this. But let me explain more, why this is an issue. And like I said, this is a common misunderstanding that a lot of people have. And I get reached out to often by local chapters that say, "Hey, will you come speak, or will you do a virtual session with our chapter?" And so one of the first questions I have to ask is, well, are you willing to pay, and what's the date, right? Because if they're not willing to pay and they're not, or the date maybe doesn't work out, then we don't really need to discuss much further, right? And it amazes me how, some of the organizations that actually have money. So I've been reached out to by very large local IIA chapters who have lots of money. I know they have lots of money because they have lots of members, right? And it surprises me how often they say, "Oh no, we don't pay for speakers." And some of you that may be at the local chapter, you can understand that. I understand the economics of local chapters. I used to be a local chapter president. I used to be a district representative. I understand, right, what goes on at that level. And what I always appreciate is, especially when a small chapter reaches out and they say, you know, we don't have a lot of money, but we'd like to pay you. And I say, well, again, I don't expect you to pay what my full rates are, but what can you do? Right. Because again, I don't necessarily do this for the money. I have to have money, obviously, to pay my bills, but it's more important for me to serve and to have people who actually appreciate the value that I bring, to be willing to pay something. And so again, I usually work with people on what the budget is if they're actually willing to pay. Now, again, some of you may be listening and thinking, well, I don't see what the problem is in having free speakers, right? We should all be willing to share. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't share, but there are some negative consequences to expecting people to do things for free. And here's what it is. And sometimes it becomes a vicious cycle that people don't actually realize. And so here's how it looks. A lot of local IAA chapters have a hard time getting their membership to come to their meetings. So, for example, the last chapter that I belonged to had about 700 members, but they were lucky to get 30 or 40 people coming to an event. Now, why do you think people didn't come to an event? Because most of the people didn't find value in what they were receiving from the event. Now, I understand that some people are just busy, they have a busy schedule, and so they choose not to go. But for me, looking at it objectively, I didn't often go because I didn't see value. And why? Because again, they were bringing in people who were willing to speak for free, and often those people didn't really know what they were talking about. And I'll give you a real life example. I went to a chapter meeting, and there was a senior manager and a manager from a very large accounting firm who were talking about the new ISO 31000 standard, right? And it was new at the time, about risk management. And again, these managers from this firm were doing this, were sharing, right? And why were they sharing? Well, they were kind of using it as a business development opportunity. And they took some slides that the firm had prepared about the new ISO standard, and they were really just kind of reading the slides. And so I could tell that neither one of them really knew what they were talking about. I don't know if they had actually even read the standard, honestly. Okay. Now I was in charge of risk management as well as internal audit at that time. And so I was very familiar with the ISO standard. And I remember as they were, you know, talking through the slides, they got to one slide and they both kind of read the slide and they looked at each other kind of dumbfounded, because the slide said something about one of the risk response activities from ISO 31000 was increase the risk. And they both looked at each other like, no, that can't be right. Something must be wrong on the slide. And so I kind of raised my hand and I said, well, did you read the standard? Because in fact, it does say that that's one of the things that is a risk response activity. And here's why, right? This is why they put it in here. And so, again, I was disappointed at kind of the lack of understanding and knowledge of those people who were providing that presentation. So I often didn't go to a lot of those meetings. Now, again, this goes back to our progress through sharing, right? Chapters who only bring in people for free get what they deserve. And I don't mean to be harsh about this, but here's the reality, right? is if you are making money off of the free giving of other people, there is a balance, there is an energy imbalance with that. If you're making money off of something that you receive for free from someone, well, that person who provided you that knowledge, that information, deserves to be paid something for it. And you can say, well, Jason's a nice guy. He's just doing it out of the kindness of his heart. And sometimes I do, right? But that doesn't, that still doesn't clear the imbalance in the energy. And so, if you're using something that someone has given to you, some knowledge that they have given you, you really deserve or have a responsibility to give something back to them. Now, in our current, economic way that we are living, often that is in the form of money. Sometimes it could be, in even thanks, some kind of a token gift, lots of different ways that you could still try to balance that energy. But, expecting something for free eventually comes back to you. There is some karmic thing that you have to deal with. And so, again, I always kind of shake my head at it and realize that, it's interesting that a lot of these groups that are asking people to do things for free are struggling for money. They're struggling to get people to come to their events. And that's one of the reasons, right? And again, there are other examples again where, conferences are put on. Most of the speakers who come are not paid, and these organizations make millions of dollars on these conferences. And it seems like everything is okay, right? Like, well, hey, they're making money. What's the big deal? Eventually things come back. Okay. And so progress through sharing, doesn't necessarily mean that we expect things for free, but it has crept in. And I've seen this, I work a lot with internal auditors, but I work with people outside of internal audit. And one thing that I have noticed, and again, this is just my objective view, and you can agree or disagree with me on this, but for the most part, internal auditors expect things for free. They seem to be very cheap. Okay, and I'll give you a real life example, right? People in the personal development space will regularly pay $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 for training, for being parts of communities. But in internal audit, there is a very big price consciousness, and people are unwilling to even pay $1 or $10 for something, which again just blows my mind, right? Looking at this and having been in the personal development space for so long, and understanding how people outside of audit respond versus people that are in internal audit. So one thing that I would just again throw out for your consideration is, the fact that internal auditors seem cheap and seem, you may think of it as frugal, but other people view it as being, a tightwad, okay, to just use a colloquial. That ends up carrying over into how other people view you. And you may or may not realize it, but other people in your organization, other people that you interact with, are probably seeing that or sensing that from you, right? And again, there's all the jokes about accountants and other things like that, but that's just one thing for you to consider. So, progress through sharing, yes, we should share, but we should be willing to give value for value received. And like I said, that can come in different ways. It can be in money, it can be in other ways as well. Okay. But for you to just start stopping and asking yourself maybe some of these questions. Okay. So that's one way that progress through sharing is misunderstood and misapplied. Another one is blindly copying what other people are doing. And so again, we've seen this in various phases. I mean, I've been in this area long enough to have seen certain cycles. And so, one cycle that happened back in the 80s and 90s was a lot of sharing of work programs. And so, Jim Kaplan, who I love, Jim Kaplan, I've worked with him, known him well over the years. In fact, did some things business wise with him for a while before he kind of retired and sold. But he created a company called Audit Net, right? And Audit Net, one of the purposes was for people to share some of their work programs, and then other people could see and could download some of those work programs so they could get an idea of how to create their own work program, right? It was a great idea. It's a progress through sharing. Hey, you're going to do an audit of this area. I just did an audit of this area, right? And so because of that, here, let me share with you what I did. Now, obviously, if you were an Audit Net member, there were some free resources, but then there were also some other resources that you paid for, right? Because again, you're trying to balance what was going on. Now, the whole idea of Audit Net, kind of fizzled out as Jim retired and people kind of moved on. And we started doing more risk-based auditing where, the work program isn't going to look the same because the objectives and the strategies and the controls in each organization are going to be different. Now, you could still learn from other people, but you really needed to kind of tailor that into the context in which you were operating. And some people did that. But even under that scenario, a lot of people just took a work program from another company and they copied and pasted it. They blindly just kind of did the same thing that this other company did without really thinking it through. Okay. And they were just checking the box saying, okay, well, I'm doing an audit of this particular area. Here's a work program. I'm going to pull that in and have the team just go and do that work program. And so, at that point, instead of it being really a progress through sharing, it became more of a progress through plagiarism, right? At that point, we weren't really taking the information that others were providing and kind of customizing it and tailoring it to our organization. We were just blindly copying it. And again, you may look at it and say, well, I never did that. And maybe you never did, but I'm going to give you a real life example. One of the companies where I was chief audit executive, one of the first things when I came in, I, needed to understand what were the controls, what were the policies in place, what were the expectations of the organization, so I could start to develop what my audit plan should be for this department that I was developing. And so one of the first questions that I asked was, well, do we have policies? And, I was talking to the head of HR about this, and he said, oh, yeah, we've got policies. You should be able to go into one of the, break room, copy rooms. There should be a binder on the shelf that has all of our policies in it. Because several years ago, we created these policies because the board asked us to. And so we created the policies, we printed them off, we put them in the copy room so people could have access to them. And so I said, great. So I went around our corporate headquarters to all of the different copy rooms looking for these binders. And guess what? I didn't really find any. They weren't there. When I did end up finding something later, I opened it up and I started looking through it. And a lot of these policies didn't even really apply to our company. And as I started digging into it, I found out that here's what had happened, right? That we had taken policies from one of our parent companies, and people had gone through and just changed the name of the company and printed them off. They didn't, tailor or customize them to our particular organization. In fact, I found there were certain instances where they even forgot to change the name of the company, right? So at that point, yes, we were provided these policies from one of our parent companies, but we weren't really incorporating it into the context in which we were operating. We weren't taking that sharing and making it our own. We were just plagiarizing because we didn't make any changes to it really. Okay. So what does this look like to make it your own? Because I think this is one of the important things for us to learn and is often an unintended consequence of us just taking what's shared with us and copying and pasting it. Well, one thing is we look like idiots. Okay. And again, apologize for the crassness, but we look like an idiot, right? How do you think I felt when I found these policies and I saw that somebody didn't even have the detail to change the name of the company on all the policies? Well, it shows that there's a lack of thinking. It shows that there's a carelessness, right, from the person who did it before. So if, as internal audit, if we're just taking something from someone else and we're blindly applying it, we have the risk of looking silly, looking incompetent, looking careless to other people in our organization, because they're going to look at it and they're going to say, well, this doesn't even make any sense, right? How do you really know all these things if what you're providing doesn't even make sense for the company, right? And so again, you may or may not be dealing with this issue, but today I just really wanted to talk about it because I think that there are a lot of unintended consequences to just blindly copying what other people are doing. Now, I told you before, back in the 80s and 90s, we were doing this a lot in internal audit with things like AuditNet and sharing work programs. And for a while that kind of stopped, but now what I'm seeing is this is happening again. Okay. There are social media platforms for internal auditors where people are going out there, they're sharing information with each other, which is great, right? I'm not discounting it. It's great for us to share with other people. Where the problem comes in is expecting it to be free and blindly copying it. And so again, the reason I'm doing this video is I'm just concerned that certain internal audit functions, and I'm not saying it's yours, but maybe it is. I just want you to ask some questions, right? Are you just blindly taking the advice of other people? Are you just blindly doing what other organizations are doing? Or are you actually thinking for yourself, right? Because there's a difference between just checking the box and saying, yep, I did it, versus, okay, I took this information and I really customized it for my organization. And like I said, we see this often in internal audit because we tend to be so black and white, so narrowly focused. And a lot of people, with the change in the standards and other things that were going on, a lot of people were just doing what other companies were doing. And there can be a real, problem with that, is that, we may be doing things that don't make any sense for us. Or on the flip side, we may be looking at it and saying, well, this big Fortune 500 company is doing this and I'm not. So because of that, I'm not a good auditor. When in fact, yes, it may be right for this Fortune 500 company, but maybe it's not right for your organization. And it's okay to say, you know what, it's not right for my organization. Because as we authentically, look at and think about who we are, who our company is, maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't, but you have to go through and think about that process. Now, to kind of share with you, well, what does it mean to make it your own? Well, there's one thing that we can kind of look back to from an internet or intellectual property standpoint, which is if you take something that someone else has created and you just copy and paste it without making any changes to it, we call that plagiarism. We call that stealing, right? Which is kind of one of the jokes, if you will, by the title of my video today. And when we plagiarize, when we steal from other people, right, we can get taken to court, and So, what is kind of the rule of law for making it our own? And in the intellectual property standpoint, it's usually that there has to be at least 20% different. 20% different. Okay. And so what that means is, you've got to make it your own. You've got to put in some of your own time and effort, and thinking about some of these things, and not just blindly copying what other people are doing. And so, what can that look like practically? Well, again, you could take something like a work program. You could take something like a spreadsheet that somebody has created for helping you do your risk assessment and your audit plan. But, I would suggest that you not just copy and paste it blindly, but that you look at it and say, well, you know what? I really like this thing that they're doing, but I think I could improve upon it by doing this different. Or, these 5 things are very relevant for our organization, but these other 2 or 3 that they're doing is not really very relevant for my organization. And so I'm not going to do that. Right. And so that is where you're starting to make things your own. Right. Another example of that is often, as we're talking in the Audit Leader Forum. And again, this is a group of chief audit executives who we get together and talk twice a month. And in there, a lot of people will share, maybe somebody has a question about, hey, I'm looking at succession planning. What are you doing in your organizations about succession planning? So people will share, which again, progress through sharing is important, right? So people may share, what they're doing in their current organization, maybe what they've done at other organizations. And then that person takes all this input and says, okay, well, maybe I like what Bob is saying, and I like what Barbara is saying, and I like what Jason is saying, right? But I don't really, what, Joan is saying doesn't necessarily, match what I'm trying to do. And so they look at all those different things and then they make it their own, right? They're not going to just copy and paste what other people do, but they're going to get ideas from it. And sometimes the ideas that you get are not even exactly what the other person was doing, right? Maybe you look at it and you say, wow, I really, I like what they're doing, but hey, I think if I do this and this a little bit different, that will work better for me, right? And when we do that, then we're starting to create things. We're starting to make things our own. And we go from copying and plagiarizing to actually customizing it, tailoring it, making it our own. And so, again, I hope this makes sense because, like I said, I just see us now moving from an internal audit discipline, moving back into some treacherous waters for certain people who are going to maybe choose to just copy and paste or blindly follow the guidance that other people are giving them, when that guidance may or may not actually be applicable to their specific situation. But that's the topic for another video that I'm planning to do a little bit later about that. And so I'll hold off on the rest of that for now. But with that, I'm going to wrap up for today. Again, realize progress through sharing is important. We should be sharing. But when people share with you, right, you need to make sure that you're balancing the energy properly, that you're giving credit where credit is due. So even at the beginning of this video, I said, hey, progress through plagiarism, that didn't come from me, right? Doug Jones actually shared that with me. So I'm giving Doug the credit for telling me that. Now, maybe he heard it from somebody else, and that's fine, but I heard it from him. And so I want to give him credit for it, right? So think about ways that you can start giving credit to people who provide you with information. Start finding ways that you can provide value for value received, whether people are asking for money or not. Even giving somebody credit, right, is a way of kind of helping to balance that energy. And then lastly, to remember that when people are sharing with us, we need to actually make it our own. We need to customize it and go from just copying, from stealing, from plagiarizing to actually creating something new that is tailored and customized for our particular situation. So with that, hope that's helpful, and I will see you on the next video.